Pastor Karl Faase joins us again today from Australia, and he's put together a classic apologetic kit, literally every Christian should have, called Toward Beliefs, and removing the belief blockers of our day with 30 brilliant thinkers globally. And today we come to the issue of suffering. I thought it was interesting, Sam Harris said that if there was a God, he would remove suffering, and showed that he cared. This thing of suffering is all around us, and I know you've got a lot to say about it, and it was obviously probably a bullseye of this whole thing.
Yeah, you just because what you're saying that Sam Harris is saying is where most people sit. That if God is good and God loves us and he can stop suffering, he doesn't, there's something wrong. And yet that's not really picking up. It misses a heap of points, but this area is so difficult to deal with.
I have found in my own life that suffering has been the best thing to grow me. I found that some of the hardest hearts have been broken through suffering. And to me, suffering is one of the greatest tools that God sometimes does not design. Sometimes it's our own initiative, but he always uses for his glory. Now we've got a beautiful clip that we want to go to, and then I'm going to ask for your thoughts. This is a part of the kit that we want you to get.
Suffering's always been a problem for humanity. Whether it's a medical emergency, a natural disaster, or an emotional issue, why do some people have a tough life and other people get it easy? Is it luck? Is it fate? Is it karma? For the person who believes in God, or calls themselves a Christian, that's even more difficult. You see, we believe in a all-loving and all-powerful God, and therefore if we suffer, it's because either God doesn't love us because he allows it to happen, or God can't stop it. In other words, he loves us, is not able to stop it, therefore he's not all-powerful. For many, this is a philosophical conundrum, but for others, it's personal. Why doesn't God help me? Why doesn't God stop my suffering? For centuries, this has been an issue for all of humanity, and it's the issue we're going to look at in this episode.
If there is an all-powerful being, why should there be people that are suffering?
I think the fact that people suffer would test the faith of a lot of people. It would certainly test one's faith in a caring God.
I believe that suffering is quite a challenging part about any religion.
I think the problem of evil and the problem of suffering is a big problem because it doesn't really fit well within a sort of omnipotent and benevolent God.
This is, and always has been really, the most important and influential argument against the existence of God in history. Yes, indeed. Why does a good God, he's supposed to be a good God, allow suffering? Surely a good person would prevent suffering. This is a powerful argument, and it needs to be dealt with.
I see suffering as a really serious challenge to the Christian faith, and I think sometimes as Christians, we don't appreciate just how serious it is. And I've seen suffering in my life, I've seen others go through suffering, and I really wanted to be able to speak to that challenge in a way that people could connect with and find helpful.
You often hear people say, if there's an all-powerful God and he's all-loving, there wouldn't be any suffering. Now that kind of makes sense, because if there was an all-powerful God, he could end suffering. If there were an all-loving God, it sort of makes sense that he would end suffering, but we don't know that for sure. How do we know? The philosophers have worked this through for centuries. How would we know that a God of infinite wisdom could not have loving reasons for allowing pain to continue? So you can't use suffering to disprove God's existence.
You moved into medicine and decided or became a specialist in palliative care. Why did you end up there?
Palliative care, well, I guess that journey starts right back from my childhood. When I was 13 years old, my brother Tom died of bone cancer. He was only 11 years old. And that had a profound effect on my family, of course, the grief of my parents. But at that stage, even as a 13-year-old, thinking the issue of mortality, the fact that we're all mortal, even at age 11, how the doctors were responding and communicating to my parents what potentially could be done for my parents and my brother through that time, knowing that he was going to die. When I did medicine, there was no palliative medicine training at all. Those days have gone, now there is. But it was an area of interest, and some years later I became more and more interested and trained in palliative medicine.
It's hard for me to analyse all the details of my journey, but you know, my mum tells me that shortly after Dad's plane crashed and he was gone, I went up to her and asked, why did God let Dad's plane crash? Which is really strange because ours was not a God household at all. But this 9-year-old boy, faced with that kind of event, knew the right question to ask. Why God? But it was not till years later, till I was like 16, that I began to ask real spiritual questions that led to my Christian faith. I imagine that the loss of my father had something to do with it. We're all formed, shaped by our life experiences. For some people, it turns people away from faith. For others, it turns them to faith. It's hard for me to know which it was, but of course, I've had to wrestle through this question. Why, would God allow this? Where is God in the midst of it?
So Sharon, you're just publishing a book at the moment, and it's actually about suffering. Why did you choose suffering? Why that subject?
Well, I found that even though I'm a scientist, the majority of the questions that were coming to me about faith were to do with why God allows suffering, or why there is so much evil and suffering in the world. And some would say it's almost the #1 barrier against faith, this question of personal suffering.
Well, I think it's just very difficult initially to understand how a God who's all good, all loving, all powerful would allow some of the things that happen in this world to happen. I mean, if you or I, stood by when we saw some really serious suffering, even though we had every power necessary to stop it, then that would call into question whether or not we really love the people who were suffering. And so I think if we're saying as Christians that actually God is all powerful, that he's omnipotent, he can step in and do whatever he likes, he can stop suffering if he wants to, and yet he chooses not to, then I think for some people it's really understandable concern to question whether or not that God is worth trusting.
Karl, God did not allow his son Jesus to be exempt from suffering. So why? Why suffering?
Suffering is such a huge issue. And I mean, the interesting thing about that clip is in the show, we sort of set the issue up and then come up with some of the responses to the issue. And what you actually notice, I just want to say up front, is that the people that answer the questions, even Vince, the last person you heard, talks about the suffering of his cousin. John lost his dad. Frank Brennan lost his brother when he was 13. And so suffering, what I like about this episode is that suffering is not just a theological, philosophical question to be answered. It's a personal issue to be dealt with. And we'd have to say right now that there'll be people watching today that for whom this question, they're not watching this question to go, oh, I've been thinking about this. This is what they live.
Yes, every
and
day.
It's so very painful, and you're right. Jesus suffered, and he wasn't exempt from suffering, and in a way none of us are, and for all sorts of reasons, one of which is that we live in a fallen and broken world. And one of our guests in the program actually says, we'd like to think that there's another world, a better world that would exist, and it's a world that God should have created, and it's the world that we should live in. But what we tend to think is that we will live as we are now, as people who we are right now, that we will live in that world. But the funny thing is that would break that world anyway. The vast amount of human suffering is actually a result of very poor human choices, even getting to the point of evil.
And if we accept the biblical record because of the Adamic curse and the Edenic effect of it, everything is out of equilibrium in God's perfect plan.
Yeah, and we live in a broken world, and we are broken people in a broken world. Now, there's obviously that kind of militant atheist view is, well, why did God make it broken?
But again, if we accept the biblical record, in the beginning he didn't. He gave man a choice. I argue that suffering, as much as we accuse it, it's been a catalyst to bring people to faith. Most testimonies I hear are people who came to Christ in the moment of suffering and problem.
Can I tell you a really interesting story? It's not actually about coming to faith, but it's about lessons in life. I've just read Andre Agassi's book, Open, which is such an interesting read. Later in the book, he was playing in the US Open and smashed some young guy, like 6-love, 6-1 or something. And he goes to the press conference and he talks about the press conference where they said, do you feel sorry for that young guy? And he said, I would never deprive a person a lesson like that in life. You kind of think, what an interesting statement. And yet, it's actually a statement about life, Jerry.
Sure.
I mean, we grow in the most painful times. We'd love to think it was just reading a book in a comfy house that would make us grow, but we don't. We actually grow through being crushed by the world's best player at that time. That makes us better people. And would you or I want to lose some of our most difficult experience, which makes us the people we are? But boy, when you're in the middle of it, that's not what you're thinking.
And C.S. Lewis said it's God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world, huh?
And we are exceedingly deaf, you know. And look, I did remember in Australia there was a guy that a chaplain, a sports chaplain, was dealing with. He was playing with one of the best NBL clubs in Australia, basketball at the highest level in Australia, which is not very high internationally, but it is there. And he wasn't a person of faith, and he was interacting with this guy I know who's a chaplain. He said, you know, his whole question was, you know, the struggle I have is I'm not sure who to thank. You know, he had a great wife, he had a great kid. And so there was a person who, in the midst of things being good, was kind of saying, but that's not normal. Normal, it's the other way around. How do we get out of this dark hole?
Well, God has a plan when there is no plan. Like Spurgeon said, we can't trace his hand, we can trust his heart. You put together 10 different critical topics to bring people toward faith. And I think that when you review this dynamic content, it calls for a spiritual verdict to say yes to Jesus Christ, and that is exactly our focus tomorrow with Pastor Karl from Sydney, Australia. You don't want to miss it. And remember, this resource is available at our e-store.